CHAPTER II of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This recording is in the public domain. 2. 1789 to 1793. The Revolution. After the failure of the Royalist conspiracy of 1804, Napoleon uttered the famous words, "They seek to destroy the Revolution by attacking my person. I will defend it, for I am the Revolution." It was a daring transcript of the celebrated saying of Louis XIV, "L'État, c'est moi." And yet these were not words of presumptuous folly; they were only the sober truth, for in the single life of Napoleon Bonaparte was incarnate the world wide movement which we call the French Revolution. He was the builder of the social edifice of modern France, and never, says Taine, has any individual character so profoundly impressed his mark upon a collective work. It is impossible to undertake to set forth here all the causes which brought about in France that revolutionary movement to which so many of the political and social institutions of modern Europe owe their existence. But in order to understand the career of Napoleon, it is necessary to examine briefly some of the conditions out of which the Revolution grew. Only thus can we get our sense of perspective, our standard of values. For centuries France had existed under the feudal system, the essence of which was class distinctions and privileges for all except the lowest classes. At the head of the state stood the monarch, the embodiment of the might and majesty of the nation. He was subject to no control. "The thing is legal because I wish it," said Louis XVI, thus stating in a single phrase the nature of the monarchy. The king made the laws, levied the taxes, spent them as he saw fit, declared war, made peace, contracted alliances. There were in theory practically no limits to his power. Paris was the capital of France, but the king lived 12 miles away at Versailles in the most magnificent palace in Europe, built during the preceding century at a cost of 500,000,000 francs. Luxury was everywhere the prevailing note. The court was composed of 18,000 people. In 1789, on the eve of the Revolution, when the nation was bankrupt, the total yearly cost of the court was not far from 100,000,000 francs. Nearly half of the national income was required for the payment of the interest on the national debt, which in 12 years had increased by nearly 3,000,000,000 francs. Every year the expenditures were largely in excess of the receipts, and the resulting deficit was met by new loans. At last the time had come when no one was willing to loan to the state, and bankruptcy was imminent. It was impossible to increase the taxes. The nobles and the clergy were practically exempt from taxation, and the remaining class, the third estate, was already taxed to the limit. The financial situation could no longer be ignored, and the king was finally forced to make an appeal to the people by summoning their representatives. Louis XVI was a good, well-meaning man, but deficient in education and totally lacking in distinction either of body or mind. He was awkward, timid, slow, and uncertain. No king could have been less to the manner born. He was entirely under the influence of the Queen, greatly to his misfortune as well as that of France. Marie Antoinette was the daughter of the great Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, and she had been married to Louis in the hope of thus cementing an alliance between two states which had long been enemies. She was beautiful, graceful, and vivacious, and could not very well help despising her lout of a husband. She had a strong will, a power of rapid decision; but she was lacking in wisdom and experience, and utterly failed to understand the French temperament and the spirit of the times. She had been born to the purple, and had grown up in Vienna, one of the gayest of capitals. Her education was very defective. When she came to France to become the wife of Louis, she could hardly read or write. Young and frivolous, wilful and impatient of restraint, she committed many indiscretions, and laid herself open to gossip and calumny. At the beginning of his reign Louis had entrusted the management of the finances to Turgot, a great statesman, and a man of rare ability and courage. He announced his programme to the King in the words, "No bankruptcy, no increase of taxation, no more borrowing." But although he saved many millions by suppressing useless expenditures, he offended those who benefited by existing abuses, and who were opposed to all reform, including the Queen, who thus helped to aggravate the financial situation and hasten the catastrophe. Louis finally yielded to the vehement importunities of the Queen, and dismissed his ablest minister. Turgot was succeeded by Necker, a Genevan banker, who was the father of the notorious Madame de Staël. He was a self made man, who had risen from poverty to great wealth. Necker had the courage to publish a financial report showing the income and expenditures of the State. This audacious step infuriated the members of the Court, and the King was once more forced to yield to the storm, and Necker was dismissed. This time the Court took no chances, and a Minister of Finance was found in Calonne, who was only too ready to gratify their wishes. His purpose was to please, and please he did, for a while. Calonne was a charming man of graceful address, who was past master of the gentle art of spending. In 3 years, in a time of profound peace, he borrowed 1.5 millions of francs. Then the treasury was empty, and it was impossible to float any more loans. He proposed a tax to fall upon nobles as well as commoners, and at once met the fate of Turgot and Necker. Every other resource having been exhausted, the King now yielded to the popular demand, and summoned the States General to meet at Versailles the 1st of May, 1789. Thus opened a new chapter in the history of France. The States General was an assembly representing the 3 estates of the nation: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. It was an old institution of France, but one that had never fully developed like the Parliament of England. The last previous meeting had been held in 1614, during the early days of the reign of Louis XIII. It was now revived as a last resort, in a great national crisis, in the hope that it might pull the State out of its deplorable situation. Formerly, each one of the 3 estates had had an equal number of delegates, and each estate had met separately. This organization was manifestly impossible now, if anything was to be accomplished, as it left the nation exactly where it had been, in the hands of the privileged classes. At the first meeting, held the 5th of May, 1789, there were about 1,200 members present, of whom over a half were members of the Third Estate. In reality, however, the number of delegates in sympathy with the cause of the people was much greater, as over 200 of the 300 representatives elected by the clergy were parish priests, all commoners by origin. During the first sessions there was practical unanimity on the part of clergy, nobles, and commoners in the formal statements of grievances and of the reforms they favored. Deep affection was expressed for the King, and gratitude for his summoning of the States General, and there was a general feeling of hopefulness that a way would easily be found to extract the nation from its unfortunate plight. But the Government had no plan to offer. The King, in his opening speech, was silent on the great question of the Constitution, and had nothing to say about whether the Estates should vote by order or by head. The Government thus shirked its responsibility and lost its opportunity, and a serious crisis soon developed. A conflict between the orders on the question of voting began on the 6th of May, and lasted until the end of June. Both sides stood firm, and the Government allowed things to drift. Finally, a majority of the clergy and a minority of the nobility yielded, and on the 27th June the King commanded all to sit with the Third Estate in a single assembly. The National Assembly was now complete, and its first act was to appoint a committee on the Constitution. This crisis was no sooner over than another began to develop. At the inspiration of the Court party, a considerable body of troops, mainly foreign mercenaries, was ordered by the King to the vicinity of Paris and Versailles. It was evident that an attempt was to be made either to intimidate the Assembly or to suppress it entirely. The Assembly was saved by the violent and totally unexpected uprising of the city of Paris, which on the 14th July stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was a fortress commanding the eastern section of Paris, which for 4 centuries and a half had terrorized the city. It had been built during the reign of Charles V. to defend the suburb which contained the royal palace of St. Pol. It was used as a state prison, and had had many distinguished occupants, among others the man with the iron mask, who died there in 1703 after 5 years of confinement. 1,000 engravings show us the Bastille as it was. It consisted of 8 round towers, connected by massive walls 10 feet thick, pierced by narrow slits. In later times it had only one entrance, with a drawbridge over the moat on the side towards the river. It was built on the line of the city walls just to the south of the Porte St. Antoine, which was approached over the city fosse by its own bridge. The capture of the Bastille was regarded everywhere in France as the triumph of liberty, and joy was universal. The 14th July was declared the national holiday. A new flag, the tricolor, was adopted. It was made up of the colors of the city of Paris, red and blue, combined with the old white banner of the Bourbons. A new military force, the National Guard, was organized. 3 days later the King came to Paris and formally ratified these changes. At the same time the revolutionary movement began to spread over France. National Guards were created everywhere in imitation of Paris. The peasants took matters into their own hands and made a violent war upon the châteaux. In this way feudalism was abolished, not legally but practically, both at the capital and in rural France. In the midst of these excesses and disorders, the middle of September, 1789, Napoleon left Auxonne for Corsica. Although the revolutionary movement had as yet hardly reached there, the whole island was in a state of great political unrest. The general desire of the people was either for independence or for incorporation in the French monarchy. The patriotic party saw that their best chance for freedom lay in an alliance with the revolutionary movement in France. There were uprisings in Ajaccio and even more desperate riotings at Bastia. The French governor was forced to hoist the tricolor over the citadel and to sanction the organization of a National Guard. Napoleon was prominent in this movement, and naturally his conduct gave offense to the authorities. The commander at Ajaccio wrote to the Minister of War in Paris that Napoleon would be much better with his regiment, for "il fermente sans cesse." Yet when his leave expired it was extended on the ground of his continued ill health. He was taking the cure of the baths of Oreza, when Paoli once more landed in Corsica, after his exile of 21 years. His journey through France had been a prolonged ovation. When he entered the harbor of Bastia on the 17th July, he was met with salvos of artillery and cries of "Vive le Père de la Patrie!" He was now 66 years of age. A tall man, with piercing eyes and long white hair. Napoleon lost no time in joining him, but their relations were not long harmonious. His leave soon expired, and he was only waiting for a favorable wind to embark. Owing to adverse winds he did not finally sail until the last of January, 1791. Napoleon was back with his regiment at Auxonne in February, 1791, after an absence of nearly 17 months. He had stopped at Valence to visit some old friends, and did not reach Auxonne until the 11th or 12th of the month. Although he had considerably exceeded his leave, and was liable to lose his pay for 3 months and a half, he was well received by his colonel, to whom he presented certificates from the authorities at Ajaccio which stated that his patriotism was above suspicion, and that his return had been delayed by stress of weather. The Minister of War acceded to the request of his colonel that the pay which he had lost by his absence, amounting to nearly 250 francs, should be made up to him. On his return Napoleon had brought with him his brother Louis, who was then about 12 years and a half old, having been born on the 2nd of September, 1778. Napoleon had undertaken this extra care in order to relieve to some extent the financial strain at home. There were thus 2 instead of 1 to support on his meagre pay of 100 francs a month. It was not easy to make ends meet. In his shabby little room there was no furniture except his bed, a table, 2 chairs, his portmanteau, and his papers and books. His brother slept on a mattress in a little cabinet adjoining his room; he himself prepared their frugal meals. During his second sojourn at Auxonne, Napoleon worked habitually 15 or 16 hours a day. He gave Louis lessons in mathematics, and was very proud of his progress. At a later period he complained of his brother's ingratitude, and reminded him that for his sake he had deprived himself even of the necessaries of life. In 1791, by a decree of the National Assembly, the organization of the artillery was entirely changed, and this arm was separated from the infantry. The regiments lost their former names, and were henceforth designated by numbers, La Fère becoming the 1st Regiment. Napoleon was appointed 1st Lieutenant of the 4th Regiment, known formerly as the Regiment de Grenoble, now in garrison at Valence. He left Auxonne for his new post the 14th of June, 1791, and arrived at Valence 2 days later. At Valence he lived in his old lodgings with Mademoiselle Beau. Louis boarded with the landlady, who looked after him like a mother, but Napoleon took his meals at the Trois Pigeons, as before. The Abbé de St. Ruf was dead, but Napoleon found several old friends and made some new acquaintances. He was an ardent supporter of the Revolution, although nearly all of the officers were aristocrats, while the common soldiers were on the side of the nation. 4 days after Napoleon's arrival at Valence occurred the flight of the royal family to Varennes, one of the most important events of the Revolution. As a result of this, all the officers were required to take an oath of allegiance to the Assembly. This oath, which had to be written out and signed by each officer, was executed by Napoleon on the 6th of July. There is no doubt that at the time he was a sincere Republican. The necessity of taking this oath had a profound effect in the army. Many officers refused to take it, and at once emigrated. No less than 32 officers of the 4th Regiment took this course. Many family ties were broken. The famous Desaix, who fell at Marengo, took the oath, whereas his 2 brothers remained faithful to the Ancien Regime. Serrurier, while attempting to escape into Spain, was stopped at the frontier, and later became a Maréchal de France. During these political excitements, Napoleon did not neglect his reading, as we know from the evidence of his note books. The abstracts which he made are very characteristic. They are generally practical in their nature, and show a strong passion for good government. At the same time he wrote an essay in competition for a prize of 1,250 francs, offered by the Académie de Lyons. But he was not successful, his essay being ranked next to the last among the 16 submitted. Having finished his essay, Napoleon applied for another leave of absence. The request having been refused by his colonel, he made a direct application to Baron Duthal, who had commanded the school at Auxonne, and was now Inspector General of Artillery for that part of France. Napoleon paid him a visit at his château, and stayed in the house several days. They discussed the art of war, and the plan for a new road from France to Italy, which was afterwards built by Napoleon. When he left, the old general said of him, "He is a man of great powers, and will make a name." Finally he received a leave of 3 months, without deduction of pay, but was ordered to rejoin his regiment in November. In September, 1791, he reached Corsica, where he remained until the following May. He was accompanied by his brother Louis. The month after his arrival he lost his great uncle, Lucien Bonaparte, the head of the house, who had been a second father to him. The archdeacon left a considerable sum of money, which helped to relieve the family necessities. At this time Paoli was master of the island. As commander of the National Guard, and president of the department, all power, both military and civil, was in his hands. He met Napoleon once, but nothing satisfactory came of the interview, and shortly afterwards Napoleon went back to France. His presence in Paris was very necessary, for his leave had expired, and he was on the list of officers absent without cause, from the general review of the 1st of January, 1792. In ordinary times he probably would have been dropped from the army, but the government could not afford to be too severe. The army had lost so many officers by emigration that they were only too anxious to retain the services of all who were willing to support the Revolution. Therefore, in July, 1792, Napoleon was reinstated with the rank of captain. He had reached Paris at the end of May, and the weeks which elapsed before his reinstatement in July marked the lowest ebb in his fortunes. He was obliged to pawn his watch, and might have perished of misery if he had not been lucky enough to run across his old schoolboy friend, Bourrienne. During the 4 months that he spent at Paris, Napoleon was an eye witness of some of the most striking events of the great drama of the Revolution. On the 20th of June he saw the King appear at one of the windows of the Tuileries with the red cap of Revolution on his head, while the mob surged and roared in the gardens below. His blood boiled at the sight of these vulgar outrages, and he exclaimed, "Why don't they sweep off 400 or 500 of that canaille with cannon? The rest would then run away fast enough." The remark was prophetic. Later, on the 10th of August, he saw the attack on the Tuileries, when the palace was taken and the Swiss Guard cut to pieces. At St. Helena he told Lacaze how, at the sound of the tocsin, he ran to the Carrousel, to the furniture shop of Fauvelet, Bourrienne's brother, where he was able to observe all the events of the day. After the palace was captured, and the King had taken refuge with the Assembly in the riding school near the present site of the Hôtel Continental, Napoleon ventured into the gardens, and was much impressed by the scenes of slaughter he saw there. Napoleon's sister Eliza was at this time a pupil at St. Cyr, one of the royal schools, which was suppressed by a decree of the 16th of August. He obtained permission to escort her home, and they left Paris just after the September massacres, and travelled by Lyons to Marseilles, reaching Ajaccio the middle of October. This was Napoleon's fifth visit home, and the first time in 13 years that the whole family had been reunited under the same roof. Eliza was received with joy. She had excellent manners and considerable ability. Of the three sisters, she is said to have been the one who both morally and physically most resembled Napoleon. When she became Grand Duchess of Tuscany, she was her own Minister of Foreign Affairs, and she had much influence over Pauline and Caroline. Napoleon, on his arrival, resumed his position of second lieutenant colonel of volunteers, to which he had been elected on his previous visit. He was soon engaged with his volunteers in an expedition against the island of Sardinia, his first real military service. Sardinia at that time seemed disposed to throw off the Italian yoke, and the French government decided to send an expedition to assist her. The fleet was under the command of Admiral Truguet, and the military forces of Casabianca, a brave man but absolutely incapable. Simonville, who was on his way as ambassador to Constantinople, was also to assist. Truguet arrived at Ajaccio, where he was to meet Casabianca. He became very intimate with the Bonaparte family, and went to their house every night to dance with the girls. He fell in love with Eliza, who indeed preferred him to Bacciochi, whom she afterwards married. But nothing came of it, and Truguet often regretted in later years that he had lost his opportunity. Simonville also stayed with the Bonapartes. He had married the widow of M. de Montelon, who had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Napoleon became much attached to Charles de Montelon, who afterwards accompanied him to St. Helena. This intimacy between the two families was continued after the Italian campaigns, when Madame Letitia was established at Paris with her family. Pauline lived with Madame Simonville, and Louis and Jérôme Bonaparte, as well as Eugène de Beauharnais, attended the same school as Charles de Montelon. The younger members of the two families treated each other as brothers and sisters. Truguet's squadron set sail on the 8th of January, 1793. In order to assist the expedition, he had formed the plan of an attack on the north of Sardinia by a small force of 250 regulars and 450 volunteers under the command of Colonel Cesari. Cesari left Bonifacio the 18th of February, and Napoleon was with him in command of the artillery and the volunteers. A landing was to be made on Maddalena, the largest of the 11 islands situated in the Strait of Bonifacio, between Corsica and Sardinia. Close to this is Caprera, which was the residence of Garibaldi at the close of his life. At this time the islands were inhabited by a few hundred shepherds and sailors who were Corsican in language and customs. France claimed the islands on the ground that had formerly belonged to Genoa. The troops landed on San Stefano, a little island to the west of Maddalena, and soon reduced the square tower, which was garrisoned only by 25 Swiss. Napoleon then built a battery, armed with a mortar and 2 small guns, and opened fire on the 2 small forts on the opposite island of Maddalena. The weather was terrible. The cold was intense, with a heavy rain and strong wind. Notwithstanding these obstacles, Napoleon hoped to be master of Maddalena on the following day. But the crew of the corvette mutinied, and threatened to set sail, leaving the soldiers to their fate. Napoleon was therefore forced to abandon the enterprise just as victory seemed certain. Whatever may be our judgment as to this unfortunate expedition, its conduct casts no reflection on the character or career of Napoleon, even if it did not add much to his military reputation. A critical stage had now been reached in the affairs of Corsica. Paoli, who was still in control of the government, had been turned against the Convention by the excesses of the Jacobins, and was strongly suspected of English leanings. He was denounced as a traitor by Napoleon's younger brother Lucien in a speech to the Jacobin Club at Toulon, and an order for his arrest was issued from Paris. This brought matters to a crisis in Corsica, and Napoleon was soon forced to make a decision between Paoli and the Convention, and he did not hesitate. From that moment he devoted all of his energies to the overthrow of his former hero and friend. After various adventures, he engaged in an unsuccessful attempt to drive the Paoli party from Ajaccio. Convinced that there was no further hope, he sent his mother a message to prepare for flight. Under the existing conditions it was no longer possible for the Bonapartes to remain in safety on the island. They had broken with the patriotic party, and cast their lot with its enemies. It was necessary for Napoleon to rejoin his regiment, so he decided to take his family with him. On the 11th of June, 1793, they all sailed for Toulon, where they arrived 2 days later, and found Lucien waiting to receive them. This was Napoleon's real farewell to his native island, although he passed a few days at Ajaccio on his return from Egypt in 1799. As Rose points out, the interest of the events above described lies, not in their intrinsic importance, but in the signal proof which they afford of Bonaparte's wonderful endowments of mind and will. In a losing cause, and in a petty sphere, he displayed all the qualities which, when the omens were favorable, impelled him to the domination of a continent. End of Chapter 2.